What's going down, everybody? It's your boy, That Guy My High, tuning back in for another reaction. This time we got rookie cop swiftly fired after this stop. What they did to destroy their career before it even started, I have no idea. But we're going to find out today. You dig what I'm saying? We're going to figure it out together. Before we jump into that, we got to give a big shout out to all of the members of the channel. Think about hitting that join button if you want to get a shout out in all the videos and the lives and take advantage of some perks. You dig. We got Gary Willis, My Hood Life, Nugget, Liz, Amy Jane Doe, Robin Lynn, Mama Dukes, Aaron, Nicole, Creatively Insane, Nick, Diesel, Marla, Holla Boy, Funny Farm, Taylor, Holla Girl, Jeffrey, Jamal, Lynn Willow, Epic Service, Happy Chick, Mr. Pay It Forward, Carrie, Marie, Kara, Ryan, Driver Thoughts, Trey 20, Sniper, Misty, and Manly. Appreciate y'all for being members and, you know, rocking with your boy in the way that you do and helping this channel achieve new heights of greatness, you dig? So, yeah. And, you know, again, if you want to, you know, get shouted out like that and be a part of this good thing we got going over here, think about hitting that join button. You got 3 different options to choose from $2.99, $4.99 to $9.99. And, yeah, think about it. But we got the free 99 too. So subscribe, bell notification. It's free 99. No excuses. All right, let's do this, man. Shout out to Audit as well for this video. And let's jump up and see what this rookie cop did to ruin their career before it even got started. Because, I mean, if you're a rookie, that's like you're still at first 2-3 years or whatever, you're still considered a rookie, right? Your first year or two at least.
Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers identification requirements, loitering laws, and reasonable suspicion, and is brought to us by Royal Muscle founder Hellcat Infamous's channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. Before we dive into the interaction, I want to give a big thanks to the sponsor of this episode, Policy Genius. There's a
Policy Genius. All right, we don't want to. Shout out to your
owner of the
sponsor,
Royal Muscle founder
sponsored.
Hellcat Infamous YouTube channel, who we will refer to as Mr. Hellcat, parked in front of a pump at the Quick Trip gas station in Locust Grove, Georgia, and exited his vehicle to make a phone call. After about 20 or 30 minutes, Officer Pitts, Officer James, and Officer Mosley of the Locust Grove Police Department approached Mr. Hellcat and began to question him about his activities.
What's going on, man? Are you hanging out? Are you meeting somebody? Are you waiting on somebody? Are you lost?
I live out here.
So, the reason I'm asking, we've been here how long? Probably 20 minutes?
30 minutes.
30 minutes?
Is it against
I
the
got
law?
any gas. You hadn't gone in and got any food. You parked at a gas pump. And I know the tank's not on this side. It's on the other side, right?
No, I don't even take this stuff away.
So, what are you doing?
I'm just chilling. I want to go home. I can't sit in the parking lot. Because I live out here.
Where you have some ID? Who's your ID? Or is it in the car?
It's on me, but what's the...
Right, bro, why did you just walk up to the... Look, she is too overzealous.
I mean, you can make it super difficult, but you do
No,
have to give me your
I'm
ID.
just wondering where
I don't have to give you ID because I'm not under arrest and
I
there's
know.
no reason for me to give you an ID.
Go and get your
I'm
ID,
not
and
suspicious
while you give us your
or
ID, she can speak with you. But you need to identify yourself, so go and get your ID.
No, I don't.
Officer Pitts asks Mr. Hellcat to provide his ID and implies
what
that
the
she wants to
fuck?
confirm that he actually does live in the neighborhood. Georgia does not have a stop and identify statute that requires individuals to identify themselves to police officers during Terry stops. However, under Georgia's loitering statute, which is found in section 16-11-36
so, 'cause I'm
of the Georgia
loitering?
Code, officers can request that individuals suspected of loitering identify themselves. The law states that, quote, a person commits the offense of loitering or prowling when he is in a place at a time or in a manner not usual for law-abiding individuals
What was
under
not-
circumstances that warrant a justifiable
sitting in
and
the
reasonable
parking lot
alarm or
on the
immediate
phone?
concern for the safety of persons or property in the
Because
vicinity.
I'm sitting in the parking lot on the phone while being black. Like what is it? You know what I'm saying? Like what was he
A
doing?
law
that made it
enforcement officer
suspicious?
shall, prior to any arrest, afford the person an
He's a car
opportunity
guy,
to
like,
dispel any alarm
times
or
you been
immediate
to a
concern
fucking
which
gas
would
station
otherwise
and
be
seen nice
warranted
cars
by
at it?
requesting the person to identify himself and explain his presence and conduct. The statute also lists an individual's refusal
This
to
nigga
identify
obviously ain't
themselves as
broke.
a factor that may be considered in determining whether alarm is warranted by the individual's behavior. However, it is unclear whether a court would agree that Mr. Hellcat's behavior warranted, quote, a justifiable and reasonable alarm or immediate concern for the safety of persons or property in the vicinity. In the 1995 case of Evans versus State, the Georgia Court of Appeals
That shit is
concluded that
wild.
reasonable suspicion existed to stop a group of individuals for loitering after they slowly drove through a shopping center parking lot for 45 minutes without parking or entering a store, and slowed down even further to closely examine a type of car that is often stolen when a high number of automobile thefts and break-ins had occurred in the shopping center parking lots. But in the 1996 case of State versus Banks, the Court of Appeals held that standing on the side of the road for no apparent purpose in a known drug trafficking area was not sufficient to support a reasonable suspicion of loitering, despite officer testimony that this was a common method of conducting drug transactions. Here, the officers cite concerns that Mr. Hellcat may be engaged in drug trafficking based on his behavior and patterns of past drug sales in the parking lot, as well as their observation of a
Fuck outta
known drug
here.
offender approaching him
Bro,
and speaking to him.
you
If
was
a court
watching it. He
agreed
was
that this
sitting
was
there with-
sufficient to
just
give
with
the
his
officers
car,
reasonable
just
suspicion,
chilling.
they would be within their authority to
They thought he
request
was
his
a drug dealer, for
identification
sure. She
and an
thought.
explanation under the loitering statutes.
thought.
But Mr. Hellcat would not be obligated to provide it. Of course, it's important to keep in mind that officers would also have the authority to take these actions without detaining Mr. Hellcat, regardless of whether reasonable suspicion existed.
So right now, what it falls under is loitering. Loitering, yes.
Yes.
Because like if you were like getting gas, waiting on somebody, like if you were doing anything other than just kind of like hanging out, it wouldn't be an issue.
Well, I'm dealing with the phone.
We know.
This area is known for narcotic activity. It's known for criminal activity. So that's another reason why we're speaking to you. We want to make sure that's not afoot.
Right here, people will park. They'll go over there. They'll wait right here. They'll wait for somebody. They'll do something like that.
And brought under a
Bro,
street
you
light?
have no idea.
So
Well,
Yes.
I live out here.
I believe you do. You know, you have your ID with you.
Is the license or is the address on your license current? Is that
No.
your? Okay. What's your current address? The state's definition of loitering.
Bro, I am so
It's doing
fucking
something not
like
like the
confused, bro.
Hanging out at the gas pump, not like the norm. You know what I'm saying? So we have to just kind of get up. Now, if you to like take off and run as soon as you see us over here,
Well, why would I do that?
well, so that's it. That would add to it, but you didn't, so it makes it look a lot better. You get what I'm saying?
Officer Pitts attempts to explain Georgia's loitering law to Mr. Hellcat, although she fails to include the requirement that the suspect's unusual behavior cause reasonable alarm or immediate concern for the safety of persons or property. Anti-loitering laws, which make it a crime for an
She's
individual
stupid.
to be in a public
I don't
place
know,
for
man.
no
You can
apparent
tell she's
reason,
new.
have a long and controversial history in the U.S., and they generally have been found to be unconstitutional when they broadly prohibit all types of loitering. U.S. loitering laws were modeled after England's quote-unquote poor laws, which were created in the 1600s during an economic depression to address the issue of large quantities of unemployed workers roaming the streets. As briefly discussed in a previous episode of ATA, the first major challenge to the constitutionality of an anti-loitering law was decided by the Supreme Court in the 1972 case of Papa Cristo versus City of Jacksonville. In finding an anti-loitering statute that prohibited loitering and defined loiterers as, quote, persons wandering or strolling around from place to place without any lawful purpose or object, to be overly broad and, quote, void for vagueness, the court held that because there were no standards governing the exercise of the discretion granted by the ordinance, quote, the scheme permits and encourages an arbitrary and discriminatory enforcement of the law. It furnishes a convenient tool for harsh and discriminatory enforcement by local prosecuting officials against particular groups deemed to merit their displeasure. It results in a regime in which the poor and the unpopular are permitted to stand on a public sidewalk only at the whim of any police officer. After the Papa Cristo decision, the majority of the country's loitering laws were revised to include additional offenses associated with loitering, creating what are known as loitering plus ordinances. While some of these loitering plus statutes have still been found to be unconstitutional, the Georgia Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of its loitering statute in the 1984 case of Bell versus State, concluding that the language used in the statute made it clear what conduct must be avoided and prevented the possibility of arbitrary enforcement.
But I literally come here all the time. I live here. That's what I'm trying to tell you.
Yeah, that's fine. But you can't just if you're not doing any business, if you're not getting gas, you're not
But
going
I
to
was
get
actually
food.
finna go in there. I just had a phone conversation.
Well, that's cool, but now that we've had this communication, it's what they call dispelling the alarm. Now that we're able to figure out, okay, this guy doesn't have any issues or anything like that, then we can be by our merry way. But we never met you a day in our life. I've never met you.
I've never gotten
She's
out.
never met you. He's never met you. So
Bro, and
we're just doing our jobs where we get paid.
So you got to meet every person in the world, or they're just a person of interest, or like what? Like make that shit make
One time, do your
sense.
business if you got to, and then head on home. All right.
Yeah, but
Second
that's
thing,
kind of
your
crazy.
look. It's
Like I've never.
Go look up loitering in the Georgia
No,
code section.
my father's a retired sheriff.
Okay. Well,
I know, but I've never.
like I said, this area is known for drug transactions. We're gonna make sure none of that's occurring here tonight.
I've
So
literally in the public eye, and I haven't spoken to them. And I know you saw the weird girl run up to my car, and I'm like,
yeah. They just came from a party
with a
down
bunch
in
of
their
a
whole ton of drugs, and we're sitting right
but
there
see,
with
my-
our blue
my
lights
car-
on.
I do a lot of stuff in the community and shit, so my car is like really well known. I race at Silver Dollar, I do track events, and I don't do no drug activity.
And like he said earlier, the reason we got out with you and asked you and didn't just like immediately throw you in handcuffs was called dispelling the alarm. That's all that happened.
We sat there for a while. We observed you. We were
Bro,
watching.
y'all
Okay,
are
this
just
guy's not
sitting
getting
there
gas. He's not going in there. We're watching everybody
bullshit.
come and go. So it already drew our attention. Then we saw somebody that we dealt with earlier with a whole bunch of drugs around here coming up to you. I'm like, okay.
Right,
So
and they said, hey, I see your car everywhere, because I live out here. They said, we see your car, SRT on the side.
Hey,
I
which,
said, thank you.
which makes sense. And that's the reason we came over here to introduce ourselves, dispel the alarm, make sure there's nothing
No, y'all
nefarious
came
going on.
over to see
Now,
if I
we're
was
gonna
a
be about our
drug
way.
dealer.
Is
Fuck
that-
out of here.
now,
Stop
if-
sitting here
if we
lying.
thought something nefarious was going on,
Stop lying.
then we'd be going a whole different direction. You understand? But we have to dispel alarm, make sure nothing nefarious is going on. You understand that?
Officer Pitts says that the only reason that Mr. Hellcat wasn't immediately thrown into handcuffs is that the officers wanted to give him the opportunity to, quote, dispel the alarm. This statement is another reference to the Georgia loitering statute, which states that, quote, unless flight by the person or other circumstances make it impracticable, a law enforcement officer shall, prior to any arrest, afford the person an opportunity to dispel any alarm or immediate concern which
Okay,
would otherwise
at
be
least doing
warranted
your
by
job.
requesting the
All right.
person to identify himself
Like
and
I said,
explain his presence
they
and
did come
conduct.
up like
However, this
nice,
does not
but it
mean
just
that Mr.
definitely was,
Hellcat
like,
was
on
under
some
any
weird
legal
shit.
obligation to
Yeah.
dispel the alarm that the
Facts.
officers were claiming
'Cause
was
that's what I'm
present.
still
As
trying
the
to figure
Georgia
out is
Supreme
why they're
Court
fucking with
discussed
him.
in Bell versus State,
the
the
loitering
case in
thing
which it
is
found the
kinda got me
loitering
fucked
statute
up,
to
like-
be constitutional.
like it'd be one thing if a motherfucker was just sitting in front of the fucking gas station, you know? Like this nigga's at the gas pump, like with a really nice car and on the phone. Like I just don't know how you justify like that just as
quote,
loitering,
does
even if it
not
was 30
require
minutes. Like,
a suspect to provide information, but rather guarantees him the opportunity to explain his conduct, thereby possibly dispelling the officer's concern for the safety of persons or property before any official action is allowed. The court also clarified that the statute did not allow an individual to be convicted of loitering whenever they fail to explain his conduct and presence to the satisfaction of the arresting officer, stating that, quote, the statute, in fact, safeguards against this situation. Section B provides in part, no person shall be convicted of an offense under this code section if it appears at trial that the explanation given by the person was true and would have dispelled the alarm or immediate concern. Therefore, if the officers had arrested Mr. Hellcat for loitering, a jury could still determine that the explanation he provided for his conduct was reasonable enough that it should have dispelled the officer's alleged concern for the safety of persons or property in the vicinity.
I guess.
Have a good night, sir.
All right, have a good night. I don't have one on me. I'm Officer James. It's Officer Pitts. That's Officer Mosley. I mean, and I definitely encourage you to go look up the code section, OCGA loitering. Loitering. Look it up.
The officers eventually
thanks.
left without arresting Mr. Hellcat, allowing him to continue with his day. 3 days after this encounter, Officer Pitts was terminated from her position at the Locust Grove Police Department. It is unclear whether Mr. Hellcat filed a complaint or plans to pursue legal action. I reached out to the Locust Grove Police Chief Derek Austin, but he would not comment on the incident featured in this episode. This could be due to the fact that he's the third Locust Grove Police Chief that's been hired in the past 4 months. He was
God
the previous two being
damn.
fired and jailed for stealing money and evidence from the department, and he was not the chief at the
What
time of
the
this encounter.
fuck?
Overall, the Locust Grove officers get a C-, because although there is an argument to be made that the officers were lawfully operating under the
Yeah, for
authority
sure.
of Georgia's loitering code,
I
they
think I
failed to
can rock
accurately
with that.
articulate the
Maybe a
statute to
D.
Mr. Hellcat, maintained an accusatory and condescending demeanor throughout the interactions, and based their decision to initiate contact with Mr. Hellcat on questionable grounds at best. There's a fine line between criminalizing innocent behavior and investigating unusual conduct. suspect. And Officer Pitts' original reason for stopping Mr. Hellcat was because he had been in the parking lot just as long as the officers had. By that logic, would the officers not be just as guilty of loitering as Mr. Hellcat?
Right.
Regardless of their suspicions, the officer's description of George's loitering law was incomplete and appeared as though it was vaguely relayed to Mr. Hellcat on purpose in an effort to quell his suspicion of misconduct. There is no denying that much of this interaction's questionable conduct could be attributed to the cryptic and ambiguous language of George's loitering law, and this interaction perfectly demonstrates how loitering laws translate to being practically enforced on the streets, and why they are vehemently opposed by many constitutional scholars and legal professionals. Mr. Hellcat gets an A- because although he failed to invoke his right to remain silent, he remained calm and collected throughout the interaction, calmly complied with the officer's orders despite a clear sense of reluctance, and for respectfully challenging the legitimacy of the officer's conduct. Being randomly approached and accused of criminal activity by members of law enforcement is an emotionally taxing experience, especially when your actions were overtly innocent. But Mr. Hellcat remained calm and compliant throughout the encounter nonetheless. The Locust Grove officers were presented with a set of facts that they chose to derive the potential for criminal activity from, rather than accepting them for their innocent nature at face value, which strongly suggests that some degree of confirmation bias may have been at play. Confirmation bias is often considered when discussing wrongful convictions, and is generally referred to as when a person selectively seeks, recalls, weighs, or interprets information in ways that support their existing beliefs, expectations, or hypotheses. There is an argument to be made that officers often experience confirmation bias as a result of their training and the effects of hypervigilance, and it is possible that constantly being exposed to crime and a sense of potential danger would psychologically predispose an individual to a more suspicious and accusatory mindset. Setting aside psychological theories, Mr. Hellcat conducted himself well during this encounter, and I suspect that he had some degree of involvement in Officer Pitts' termination, considering that he did manage to acquire the body camera footage from this encounter. Be sure to give Mr. Hellcat's channel your support. You can find a link in the description below. Let us know if there is an interaction or legal topic you would like us to discuss in the comments below.
It is what it is, man. It was just such an odd interaction from start to finish. You know what I mean? Like, it was just such a weird, just like reason to just like walk up on somebody and shit. Like, I don't know. I feel like some of the explanations they gave, it was like, oh, you know, I can understand it, I guess. You know, like if I'm reaching, right? If I'm reaching for something. But at that point, like all the explanations they gave, like you could probably, you could put holes in it. You know what I mean? Like none of them were like rock solid, like good explanations. And that's why the interaction didn't go any further than them really just having a conversation with the dude, because I think all of them knew, like, at a certain point they were like, oh, this is kind of an odd, weird situation to find ourselves in. Like, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, I don't know. It was just weird. Y'all let me know what you thought about that in the comments below. I'm gonna catch y'all on the next one. Peace.